Characters with acute shock trauma.
Oh, look what I found in the cellar! Wild thing, ain't ya?
You have probably seen people like this in real life, maybe at work, in your family. People turns every small issue into a full emergency meeting. They are always alert, not in a cool action hero way, more like someone who never fully sits back in their chair. Something always feels slightly tense around them. They react fast, sometimes before anyone finishes the sentence. If plans change suddenly, they are already annoyed. If something goes wrong, they assume it is about to get worse. These are also the people who hate surprises. Not birthday surprises, not guess-what conversations, not last-minute changes. Their brain immediately goes to, why did this change and what am I about to lose control over? In real life, this usually comes from one specific event, something sudden and ugly, an attack, an accident, losing someone in a violent or shocking way. One moment that teaches the brain a very simple rule. Bad things do not give warnings. After that, the body never fully stands down. Even during calm moments, part of the brain stays on duty, like it is waiting for the next hit. That is why a lot of people with acute trauma stay busy. They start arguments over nothing. They overwork. They fill silence with noise. Calm feels suspicious, like the quiet part of a horror movie where you know something is about to happen. Now look at Sadie Adler. After her husband is murdered, Sadie does not sit with grief. She turns into someone who is constantly moving. She jumps into fights that are not even necessary. She pushes ahead when others hesitate, and when someone tries to protect her, she reacts like they just questioned her intelligence. Relying on safety already failed once, so she is done with that option. Staying aggressive feels safer. Kieran Duffy shows the same trauma, just flipped completely. He is tense around everyone. He explains himself even when nobody asked. He sounds like someone trying to avoid setting off an invisible landmine. That is not personality. That is a survival habit. When you have been captured and threatened, your brain learns that being agreeable keeps you breathing. Then there is Jack Marston, which is probably the most uncomfortable one to watch. Jack does not become loud or rebellious after the kidnapping. He becomes quieter, more observant. He loses that carefree kid energy. He starts acting like someone who has already learned that the world is not gentle. That is acute trauma in kids. No drama and speeches, just innocence quietly packing its bags. Different reactions, same cause. One moment that permanently changes how safety feels. Characters with chronic trauma.
You don't look so...
This one is trickier because nothing obvious happens. No big moment or disaster people can point to and say, yeah, that explains it. This is the kind of trauma that builds quietly over years, usually in childhood. Unstable homes, neglect, constant danger, growing up way too early. When someone lives like that for long enough, their brain adapts, not in a dramatic way, in a practical way. You usually notice it in adults who seem emotionally distant for no clear reason. They are not cold, they are just careful. They keep people at arm's length, even the ones they care about. They avoid relying on anyone, and they definitely do not relax easily. Calm situations make them suspicious, like something is missing. These are also the people who either take on way too much responsibility or avoid responsibility completely. No middle ground. Either they are holding everything together or they are quietly disappearing when things get serious. Both are survival strategies. John Marston is a perfect example. John grows up orphaned, raised in chaos, with no real model for stability. So, as an adult, he keeps emotional distance by default. He avoids talking about feelings. He drifts. He pretends things are simpler than they are. Commitment makes him uncomfortable even when he wants it. But the second Jack is threatened, all of that restraint disappears. Chronic trauma often stays quiet until attachment is at risk. Then it explodes. John is not suddenly brave. He is terrified of losing the one thing he finally let himself care about. Abigail Marston shows the same trauma, just expressed differently. Abigail was born Abigail Roberts, and she was really an orphan. She grew up scraping by, living in places where safety was never guaranteed, and she had to fend for herself from a young age. In the game, she constantly thinks about where the next safe place is for her family. She braces for bad outcomes. She plans ahead and gets tense when things get uncertain. That makes perfect sense given her history. People who grew up without protection do not trust things to work out. They plan because planning used to be the difference between eating and not eating. To other people, it looks like anxiety. To her, it is basic survival math. And in this category, we also have Lenny Summers. Lenny is young, but he talks like someone who has already lived several lifetimes. He is thoughtful, restrained. He does not rush into stupidity unless pushed. That is what happens when childhood does not leave room for being careless. Killing his father's attackers forced him into adulthood early, so he skips the reckless phase and goes straight to responsibility. That forced him into adulthood, but he never got the luxury of being careless. So he talks and thinks like someone who already learned life is serious. That is chronic trauma. No single breaking point, just a long childhood that quietly teaches you not to expect safety and never fully trust calm. Characters with a delayed emotional trauma. You've probably met someone who gets hit by emotion not in the moment, but years later, like their feelings are on some sort of delayed settings. You know the type. They're the people who just keep going no matter what happened. Like emotional duct tape is holding everything together. In real life, people like this don't break down right when something bad happens. They work. They stay busy. They take care of everyone around them. They do too much because doing less would mean stopping, and stopping means feeling stuff. And for them, feeling stuff feels like a threat. Eventually, something happens that makes all that stuff they shoved down come rising up at once. It could be an illness, a loss, or even just one quiet evening where they are not distracted. Then all that suppressed pain, guilt, and grief suddenly show up out of nowhere. In Red Dead Redemption 2, the clearest example of this is Arthur Morgan. Arthur had always pushed forward. He woke up early. He worked the gang's plans. He helped Dutch, protected mates, and never really stopped to unpack anything heavy. That was just his way of functioning. This is not some sparkle-in-the-eye optimism. It is survival logic. He believed that the moment you stop working on the next job is the moment you have to face all the junk in your head. Then Arthur gets tuberculosis, confirmed by a doctor in Saint Denis during the story. This illness doesn't just slow him down physically, it cracks open years of emotional stuff he never dealt with. All the guilt about choices he made, people he loved or hurt, beliefs he held starts flooding in because his illusion of endless time is gone. The disease makes time feel real, and that's when Arthur finally allows all the pushed-down emotion to surface. And then we also have Hosea Matthews. Hosea lost his wife Bessie long before the events of the game. The lore actually says he was devastated and drank heavily for a long time. Eventually, he softened into this more cautious, reflective version of himself, almost like the emotional energy went quiet and settled into tiredness rather than dramatic explosions. This is how suppressed grief often shows up in real life as well. People don't always rage right away. Sometimes they just get tired. Characters with moral injury trauma.
Be quiet!
You know that feeling when you see something happen and it sticks with you? Not because it hurt you directly, but because it violated what you felt was fundamentally wrong? Like you watched someone get treated unfairly and afterwards it bothers you more than it should? That is what we mean by moral injury. It is not just trauma from violence. It is trauma from watching or being part of things that crash right through your sense of right and wrong and leave behind a kind of lingering guilt or rigid sense of principle. People with this kind of trauma don't always act dramatic about it. They don't punch walls or lose it in big outbursts. A lot of times they respond by tightening up their own moral compass. They insist on doing the right thing even when it is expensive or difficult. They can feel guilty in situations where others just move on. They can also withdraw from violence or commitment because what they saw sticks in their head. And sometimes they obsess over fairness and justice because, to them, that is all that wasn't taken away. In Red Dead Redemption 2, two characters especially show this kind of thing. First is Charles Smith. Charles is quiet and reserved, but he is one of the most principled people in the gang. He grew up with mixed heritage, with a Native American mother and an African American father, and came of age at a time and in places where neither part of his identity was ever fully welcomed. As the story tells it, his mother was taken by the U.S. Army and never seen again, and his father fell into depression afterward. Charles ran away young and spent years surviving on his own before joining the gang. He sees injustice, cruelty, and needless suffering in the world, and it bothers him in ways that make him stand up more strongly for what he thinks is right. He does not flinch from violence when it feels like protection or justice, but he does not celebrate it casually either. His morality is not soft, but it is rooted in his life story. Then there is Rainsfall. Rainsfall was once a warrior, someone who fought to protect his people. Over time, after countless betrayals and broken treaties that displaced his tribe and cost him most of his family, he became a pacifist. The game canon shows him trying to negotiate peacefully, even when others around him want revenge or retaliation. He does not choose violence lightly, not because he is naive, but because he saw what violence did to his people and refused to let it take his soul, too. Characters with identity collapse trauma.
Indentured men, my people, peasants, starving.
Some people build their entire identity around one big idea, maybe work or being the fixer or having everyone look to them for direction. Then one day that thing starts to fall apart, and suddenly they act like someone pulled away their security blanket. That is identity trauma. It happens when someone's sense of self gets threatened so much that their whole worldview starts cracking. Instead of changing, they tighten up. They talk more, listen less, and push harder to prove they're still right. It is not a calm process. It is kind of like watching someone argue with reality and refuse to lose. In real life, this shows up a lot. People become defensive when their self-image is challenged. They start explaining themselves constantly. They blame others for things they once took responsibility for. They repeat their old beliefs louder, even when those beliefs clearly are not working anymore. It is like they are hanging on to the identity because losing it feels like losing everything. In Red Dead Redemption 2, the character who best represents this kind of trauma is Dutch van der Linde. Dutch starts out with a pretty defined sense of who he is and what the world should be. He sees himself as a leader of free spirits, a guy fighting against a corrupt system that is trying to squish independence out of the world. That part is straight from his biography. He starts his own gang and paints life as a kind of philosophical rebellion against authority and bureaucracy, and people follow him because he sounds confident and righteous. But as the game goes on and the Wild West ends up crushing his plans, his confidence starts to twist into something else. Success gives way to failure. His plans keep going wrong, and instead of adapting, he doubles down on talking about his ideals more and more. He starts sounding less like a leader and more like someone arguing with himself. Instead of listening to the gang, he lectures them about faith and destiny. Instead of calming people, he pressures them. The world proving him wrong does not make him rethink himself. It makes him cling and defend harder. Dutch ends up blaming others. He warns of betrayal everywhere. He refuses to accept that his vision might be broken. That's identity trauma in action, where losing the ideal feels like losing meaning. And yes, that can get pretty messy. Characters with desensitization trauma.
Gentlemen,
Found anything?
I think so.
You have probably met someone who treats chaos like it's just another Tuesday. Violence, conflict, screaming, threats, everything feels normal to them. This put them in a calm situation and they look bored, irritated, or restless, like someone turned the volume down on life and forgot to tell them why. This is what happens when trauma is never processed because it has always been there. There is no before. Violence is not an interruption to life, it is life. People like this usually show a few things. They do not react much to pain, especially other people's pain. They escalate situations instead of de-escalating them. They chase stimulation. They provoke, push things further than they need to go because calm feels empty and meaningless. To outsiders, it looks like cruelty or confidence. Internally, it is a nervous system that only feels awake when something is on fire. In Red Dead Redemption 2, this is Micah Bell. Micah does not flinch at violence. He does not pause to reflect. He does not feel conflicted. Violence is his default setting. When there is an option to talk things out, he pushes towards shooting. When things are already bad, he makes them worse. And when nothing is happening, Micah gets agitated. He stirs things up. He insults people. He pokes at authority. He looks for friction like it owes him money. That is the key thing here. Micah does not use violence to solve problems. He uses violence to feel alive. This is what happens when someone grows up in brutality and never learns another way to regulate emotion. Calm feels wrong. Silence feels unbearable. Chaos feels familiar. That is why Micah fits so perfectly into this category. He is not reacting to trauma. He is operating inside it. And that is why he is one of the most uncomfortable characters in the game, because he shows what happens when violence is not questioned, not processed, and never interrupted. Characters with inherited trauma. This one hits close to home for a lot of people, even if they never had a single big traumatic event themselves. Intergenerational trauma is what happens when you grow up inside someone else's pain. You inherit the fear, the anger, the urgency, even if you did not personally experience the original loss. You learn how the world works by watching how the people before you react to it. In real life, this often shows up as impatience, a constant sense that time is running out. People like this struggle to sit back and wait for peaceful solutions, because waiting has never worked in their family history. To them, urgency feels reasonable. Calm feels irresponsible. You will hear people say things like, "We cannot just stand around," or "If we do not act now, we lose everything." It sounds dramatic, but from their point of view, it is experience talking, just not their own. In Red Dead Redemption 2, this is perfectly shown through Eagleflies. Eagleflies did not personally lose everything yet, but he grew up surrounded by stories of broken treaties, stolen land, and violence against his people. He lives in a world shaped by loss. So when conflict starts building, his response is immediate action. He pushes for confrontation. He takes risks and sees hesitation as weakness, not because he is reckless, but because history taught him that waiting usually ends badly. His anger is not just personal, it is inherited. He is carrying frustration on behalf of people who never got justice. Now look at Rain's Fall, and this is where it gets interesting. Rain's Fall lived through many of those losses himself. He lost family members. He watched promises collapse again and again. But instead of becoming more aggressive with age, he moves in the opposite direction. He chooses restraint. He avoids violence even when it costs him politically and personally. This contrast is important. Same history, trauma, completely different response. Eagleflies acts like time is running out. Rain's Fall acts like violence has already taken too much. This is exactly how intergenerational trauma works in real families. One generation becomes cautious, the next becomes restless, one parent freezes, the child charges forward. Different reactions, same inherited wound, inherited trauma, attachment loss trauma.
He's broken Daddy's heart.
There is a kind of trauma that does not explode and it does not happen in a moment. It happens over a lifetime of losing people you care about, of being pulled away from the ones you want to protect, or of never quite believing that love will stick around. People with this trauma are often the ones who pull back right when things start to get close. Not because they do not want connection, but because connection has hurt them before. They might say they are fine. They might even laugh about it. But at the same time, they are keeping one eye on the door and the other on everything that could go wrong. It shows up as hesitation or avoidance or treating affection like a game where you always leave first so you do not get left behind. Calm moments with people, they can feel suspicious. Deep relationships, sometimes the safest thing to them is to stay just a little bit distant and hope no one notices. In Red Dead Redemption 2, a powerful example of this comes from Arthur Morgan and his past with Mary Linton. Arthur and Mary were more than friends. They were once engaged, young and in love, but that life never worked out because Arthur was an outlaw, and Mary came from a world that could not accept that. Years later, when they meet again, it is clear the connection is still there, but Arthur cannot step fully into it. He talks about needing time, about responsibilities, about priorities. He is holding part of himself back even in those moments of openness. Their relationship fell apart not because feelings vanished, but because Arthur cannot escape who he thinks he is and what that means for someone he loves. And then look at Arthur's relationship with his own son, Isaac. Arthur visited Isaac and his mother Eliza when he could, but he never built a stable family life. Both are killed, and Arthur carries that loss quietly. It shapes how he approaches other relationships, including with John and Jack. It is not drama, it is grief folded into every decision. That is attachment trauma, wanting connection, but flinching away because the cost of loss has been written into your heart.